Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the EmpowHERed podcast. If you're new here, I am your host, Alkistis, and welcome. Today's episode is one I've been wanting to share for a while because it hits home for me personally. Setting boundaries. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where saying no felt impossible, or where the idea of setting a boundary made you uncomfortable, you're not alone. For many of us, boundaries can be a struggle, especially if we were raised to please others or to avoid conflict. Today, I'll share how boundaries have been a journey for me and dive into some powerful insights from the boundary expert Terri Cole, who has inspired me to reshape my own understanding. We'll explore what boundaries are, why they're important, and how to start setting them with difficult people, yes, even those impossible types who test our patience. If you're ready to reclaim your time, energy, and self-worth, if you're new to the EmpowHERed podcast, welcome. I'm your host, Alkistis, and this is a space dedicated to self-discovery, womanhood, and embracing all parts of ourselves, even those that often stay in the shadows. Here, we dive into the real, sometimes raw topics that don't always get the attention they deserve. From personal growth to navigating boundaries, healing, and everything in between. This is a space where you feel free to explore, question, and grow. Please make sure to subscribe and join us to building in a strong, supportive community together. Every voice here matters. With each episode, we're creating a space where we can feel heard, supported, and inspired. Thank you for being part of the EmpowHERed. So let's begin. To kick things off, let's talk about what boundaries actually are. Terri Cole defines boundaries as our personal guidelines for what's okay with us and what isn't. In her words, boundaries are the rules you create to let people know how to treat you. They're essential to protect our energy, values, and sense of self. But many of us didn't grow up knowing how to set them. In her work, Terri explains that boundaries are like an invisible fence around our emotion and physical space. They give us the freedom to say yes to what nourishes us and no to what drains us. But here's the thing, boundaries are more than just saying no. They're about self-respect and creating relationships where both parties feel valued. And as Terri points out, setting boundaries isn't just about keeping people out. It's about inviting the right people in. I'll admit, growing up, I was taught to keep the peace, to make others happy, to keep my mouth shut, and to put my needs last. This made boundaries feel almost impossible for me. It's only recently that I started to see boundaries not as a way to keep others away, but as a powerful tool to self-respect and connection. Let's face it, some people make boundary setting feel nearly impossible. Terri Cole calls these relationships boundary resistant because the other people might disregard or dismiss our limits. This can be especially true with narcissistic or passive-aggressive personalities who often view boundaries as a personal threat. Terri breaks down a few common traits of boundary-resistant people. They often push back when we try to set limits. They might react with anger, defensiveness, or manipulation. They have a strong sense of entitlement or expect others to accommodate them at all times. If you're dealing with someone like this, you might feel drained after every interaction. For me, recognizing these signs was huge. I had to understand that setting boundaries doesn't make me selfish or unkind. It simply means I'm protecting my own energy and mental health. And for those of us who've been conditioned to keep the peace, this can feel uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Terri shares a powerful reminder here. Boundaries aren't about changing others. They're about taking care of yourself. We can't control how people respond to our boundaries, but we can control how we communicate and hold them. For those of you who have perhaps tuned in one of the recent episodes, you know that motherhood has been my most radical awakening. It's been a journey that has, more than anything else, taught me the importance of boundaries, not just in theory, but in practice, every single day. I've come to understand that if I want to be the mother I aspire to be for my children, I have to protect my energy and ensure that I'm not constantly drained by others. One of the greatest lessons motherhood has gifted me is that boundaries aren't just something I tell my children I bowed. There's something I have to model through my actions. Kids are perceptive. They pick up on everything. If I'm not consistent with my boundaries, if I'm consistently giving in demands from others, or if I let my energy be depleted by boundary-resistant people, I can't show up fully for my children. This realization has reshaped how I view every relationship in my life. I think many of us don't even realize how much emotional leaking we're doing in boundary-resistant relationships until we're forced to take a step back. By emotional leaking, I mean those little bits of ourselves we give away, often unconsciously, by tolerating disrespect, by saying yes, or allowing our emotional energy to be drained by others who don't reciprocate. It's exhausting. And as I transitioned into motherhood, I found that I just couldn't afford those leaks anymore. Motherhood made it clear that I needed to be very mindful of who I allow into my inner circle. It's become essential to recognize relationships where my boundaries are challenged or ignored, especially by people who tend to view boundaries as inconveniences. These are the boundary-resistant people that Terri Cole talks about, and they often exhibit certain traits. They may have a strong sense of entitlement, expect you to bend for their needs, or to push back when you try to assert yourself. For me, the choice to set boundaries became a way to honor both myself and my role as a mother. I realized that protecting my energy wasn't just a necessity for me. It was an act of love toward my family. And though it hasn't been easy to put boundaries into action, let me tell you, especially with people who don't understand or respect them, I've come to view it as an essential part of staying grounded and present. When you set boundaries, especially with boundary-resistant people, it's not just saying no to others. It's about saying yes to yourself and to those who genuinely value and support you. I've learned that people who truly care about you don't demand access to your energy at the expense of your well-being. They respect and even encourage you to protect what's important to you, including your peace, your mental health, your family, yourself. If you're a parent or someone juggling multiple responsibilities, you may relate to this energy to conserve and prevent those emotional leaks. Being mindful of who and what drains us and recognizing the patterns in boundary-resistant relationships is one of the most empowering steps we can take for our well-being. One of the most eye-opening concepts I learned from Terri Cole's work is the idea of a boundary blueprint. This is essentially the foundation of our boundary-setting behaviors, shaped by our upbringing, family dynamics, and early experiences. Our blueprint often dictates how we approach boundaries, whether we struggle with saying no, find it difficult to express our needs, or have a tendency to overextend ourselves to others. For me, digging into my own boundary blueprint was both enlightening and very challenging. Growing up, I was raised in a household where keeping the peace was valued, and speaking up about my own needs wasn't always encouraged. Over time, I internalized this and going along to get along, and often found myself suppressing my needs to avoid conflict. This pattern followed me into adulthood, where I'd find myself overcoming saying yes when I meant to say no, and not feeling entitled to ask for what I needed. It's a classic pattern, especially for those of us who grew in environments where setting boundaries wasn't modeled or encouraged. Terri encourages us to reflect on those early experiences as a way to understand why setting boundaries might feel so uncomfortable or even wrong. For many of us, our boundary blueprint is rooted in a sense of loyalty or fear. Fear of being judged or not being liked, or of losing relationships. If you were raised in a household where your needs weren't acknowledged, or where there was an unspoken expectation to be there for others no matter what, you might find yourself prioritizing other people's comfort over your own, even when it's draining. To help identify your own boundary blueprint, Terri suggests asking a few reflective questions. For example, how did your family handle conflicts or disagreements? Were you encouraged to express your needs, or was that seen as selfish? When you think back to times you tried to set boundaries, how did people around you respond? These questions were profound for me. They helped me see that some of my struggles with boundaries were inherited, learned patterns, not flaws in who I am. Recognizing this was empowering because it allowed me to approach boundary setting from a place of understanding and not self-blame. I could see that my discomfort from boundaries wasn't a personal failure, but rather than a reflection of the environment I grew in. Once we understand our boundary blueprint, we can start rewriting it. For me, it was about realizing that I had the right to set boundaries even if it felt uncomfortable or unfamiliar at first. I started by practicing small no's and expressing my needs in a way that felt manageable. I began with people I trusted, those who valued my well-being and encouraged me to protect my energy. It's a gradual process of relearning and resetting, but every step brings us closer to a healthier relationship with ourselves and others. If you're someone who's been a people pleaser or a caretaker, challenging your boundary blueprint might feel radical. But it's one of the most freeing things you can do. You're not just breaking old patterns, you're creating new ones that honor your worth and well-being. In this journey, self-compassion is key. It's easy to be hard on ourselves, especially if we've internalized the belief that setting boundaries is selfish. But here's a truth I've come to embrace. Setting boundaries isn't about rejecting others. It's about choosing to be true to ourselves. As we understand our boundary blueprint and start rewriting it, we learn that saying no is a gift, not just to ourselves, but to everyone in our lives, because it allows us to show up fully and authentically. This realization was a turning point for me. Without setting boundaries, I felt like a nobody. I was pouring myself into others, constantly adapting to their needs, and it left me feeling empty, almost as if I didn't exist beyond what I could give. It's a feeling that I know resonates with many people, especially those who tend to put others first. Boundaries, I've come to understand, are the foundation of our identity. When we fail to set them, it's easy to lose ourselves in the roles we play: caretaker, peacekeeper, problem solver, until there's barely anything left of who we really are. It wasn't until I started to assert my own needs that I began to feel like a whole person. Setting boundaries became a way of reclaiming myself, of affirming that my needs and energy mattered. Terri Cole's words say this better. She emphasizes that boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges that allow us to connect with others while still staying connected to ourselves. For me, the shift was powerful. I realized that boundaries were the missing link between feeling like a nobody and truly owning my worth. It's not an overnight change. It takes practice and patience. But each time we set a boundary, we're reinforcing our identity. We're saying, this is who I am, and this is what I need. It's like piercing ourselves back together, one boundary at a time. And slowly but surely, we start to feel whole. I knew that if I wanted to truly become someone who felt whole, grounded, and strong, I had to make this change. And let me be real with you. There can be a lot of guilt involved at first, especially if you're a boundary beginner, as Terri Cole calls it. When you've spent most of your life adapting to others and trying to keep everyone else happy, setting a boundary can feel almost rebellious, like you're doing something wrong. Terri's insight on this was so validating for me. She reminds us that it's normal to feel guilt, especially when setting boundaries with what she calls impossible people, those individuals who simply won't take no for an answer or who push every limit. But let me tell you, as hard as it is, the inner strength that comes from finally saying, this is what I need and this is where I draw the line, is beyond words. Setting boundaries becomes a powerful declaration of self-respect. With each boundary I set, I felt a new layer of strength and clarity forming within me. It's like I was gradually building this core of resilience that I never knew I had. And that resilience started to spill over into other areas of my life, allowing me to show up more fully as the person I wanted to be, not just for myself, but for my children, my family, and even my work. So if you're feeling guilty, if you're questioning whether setting boundaries is selfish, know that these feelings are normal and they will pass. Over time, you'll come to see that boundaries are one of the most compassionate things you can do, not only for yourself, but for the people you care about. Because when you're standing in your own strength, grounded in who you are, everyone around you feels that energy. Self-care has become such a popular phrase, but I want to dive deeper into something that feels even more essential: self-love. Real self-love isn't just about treating yourself to a spa day. It's about cultivating self-compassion and giving yourself the permission to meet your own needs without apology. For me, this means moving away from perfectionism, away from chasing validation, and instead focusing on boundaries as the truest form of self-love. Setting boundaries isn't about shutting people out. It's about creating space where you can show up as the best version of yourself. It's learning to be gentle with yourself and recognizing that your needs matter. When we say yes to others constantly, we're often saying no to ourselves. Boundaries are a way to realign with what truly serves us. True self-compassion is about embracing the changes happening within us, but it's also about recognizing the ways these changes affect our relationships. When we grow, we set boundaries. It often disturbs the balance that others have grown comfortable with. Some people resist these shifts because they're uncomfortable with the unknown. They want the familiar version of us that they can predict, that they can control, the one they're used to. But here's the thing, real self-love means honoring our growth, even when others can't or won't embrace it. Embracing change isn't just about allowing ourselves to evolve. It's about allowing our relationship to evolve as well. When we begin to live with more authenticity, those who value our true self will adapt and respect the changes we're making. However, those who cling on an old version of us, who may try to pull us back into patterns we're outgrowing, reveal that they may not serve us in a meaningful way on our journey. They might be comfortable with the you that doesn't have boundaries, the you that always accommodates. It's essential to recognize this resistance, not as something we need to fix, but as a signal. This discomfort isn't a reason to return to who we were. It's a reminder to lean into our growth. When we choose boundaries, we're choosing to prioritize our needs and affirm that our own well-being is a core value. And yes, there can be guilt, especially if we're new to setting boundaries. But that's because this journey asks us to be someone new, someone who doesn't rely on others to define our worth. Instead, we start looking inward. Sometimes letting go of these resistant relationships can be one of the most liberating acts of self-love. Surrounding ourselves with people who respect and encourage our growth rather than hold us back is essential. These are the people who see our potential, who accept our evolution, and who believe that we are worthy of change, even if it means that they need to get to know a different version of us. And if they're on their own path of growth, they'll appreciate us for modeling the very boundaries they might want for themselves. Boundaries are the highest act of self-love because they require us to face change head-on. It's about compassionately accepting that not everyone will want to join us on this journey. But remember, boundaries aren't walls. They're a door we open to relationships that support, inspire, and honor who we are becoming. One of the biggest hurdles in setting and maintaining boundaries is the guilt that often follows. For many of us, especially if you're new to boundary setting, it's easy to feel like we're being selfish or uncaring. But here's the truth. Boundaries are not betrayals to others. They're just a commitment to ourselves. When we step into this space of honoring our needs, guilt is a normal response, especially if we're used to putting others first. However, releasing that guilt is key to building self-trust. By embracing our boundaries, we're telling ourselves, I trust that my needs matter. This shift isn't about disregarding others, but about balancing our care for others with care for ourselves. Releasing guilt also means reframing our understanding of boundaries. Rather than viewing them as something that distances us from others, we can see them as invitations for deeper, more respectful connections. We can clearly express what we need. We're giving others the opportunity to understand us more fully, to engage with us in ways that uplift both sides. And in turn, we create space for relationships that allow us to show up authentically without resentment or burnout. Ultimately, boundaries are acts of self-compassion. They remind us that we deserve to thrive and that we don't need to diminish ourselves to be loved. Embracing this truth is a gradual process, and it's okay if it feels uncomfortable or even selfish at first. Trust that by committing to this path, you're creating a foundation of respect both for yourself and for the people who genuinely value you as you are. As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to remember this. Setting boundaries is one of the most courageous acts of self-love you can take. It's not easy. And yes, it can be uncomfortable, especially when others resist the changes you're making. But each time you stand up for your needs, you're affirming your worth. You're telling yourself that your well-being matters. You're choosing to honor the person you're becoming, not the person others want you to stay. Boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're about building a life where you can show up fully, authentically, and with the energy to give and receive in a way that feels balanced. It's a journey, and you don't have to do this alone. We're building a community right here, a space for support, reflection, and growth, where every voice can feel heard and respected. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts with us. Let's build this safe space together, a community where we can all be our truest selves without fear of judgment. Thank you for being here, for listening, and supporting one another on this path. Until next time, keep honoring your boundaries and your worth. You deserve it. See you soon.